Sensitive Species Advisory Committee. We'll give it just a second and I'll do roll call to make sure we have all of our members present. My screen is can't hold all the people that are participating. Okay, I'll go ahead and just do a roll call. Plipco, who's going? Carmen, are you going to be representing? I see you on there.
Yes, yes, I am.
DWR, is Mike Falks on?
I'm here, Rory.
Okay.
Good morning.
Division of Oil, Gas, and Mining. Okay, I'll come back to them. Water Resources.
Hey, Rory, this is Todd. I'm here. Good morning, everybody.
Thanks, Todd. Okay. Well, we need to have someone from Oil, Gas, and Mining. So as soon as they join, we can start.
Rory, John just showed up.
Hey, John. Okay, we've got everyone on board. So welcome, everyone. I'm going to just go to the second agenda item and turn this over to Kim for her presentation on the proposed sensitive species list that will be that this committee will provide comments on that will go to the Wildlife Board. So Kim, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, I'll share my window here. All right, hopefully you're seeing the presentation now.
Yes.
There we go. All right, thank you everybody for joining today. We're really excited to share this update to the sensitive species designation for species. And first I'm going to start with a little background about the rule and why we do this before getting into the species that we proposed. The sensitive species rule establishes a process for designation of sensitive species. It establishes this committee, and it tells a little bit about what the sensitive species designation means. There were updates to the rule in 2018 that went through. Some of the larger changes where it changed the automatic inclusion of ESA listed species. And some of those species we're not going to plan to manage for example, the grizzly bear. So that's no longer something that's on our list. And it also removed a habitat designation that had never been used in the history of the rule. And because it's been quite a while since we brought forward any new designations to the committee, and because of the rule update, we decided to come forward with a full list revision this time. Instead of just taking one or two off and on, we're thinking about this as starting fresh with a full suite of species. So the designation process is the Division of Wildlife submits the recommendations that you should all have seen, and those are backed by supporting information. Today, the committee is meeting to review those. Then the proposal backed by the executive director will be brought to the Wildlife Board, and they'll give the final approval on the rule. If everything goes well, we plan to present that at the August board meeting. So what is the goal of the designation? First and foremost, we want to prevent further impairment of the native wildlife of Utah. And one of the big reasons we want to do this is to prevent additional Endangered Species Act listing. We want to keep the management authority with the state and prevent the need for any burdensome regulation that comes with the Endangered Species Act. Sensitive species designation also helps us to develop and prioritize research and management, and informs the natural resource management that's going on the ground. We want to identify those species that are in need of conservation attention. And conservation attention can mean a lot of different things. It's everything from traditional wildlife management, transplants, dealing with disease concerns, to things like habitat restoration, and prioritizing things through the Wild Watershed Restoration Initiative. Impact reduction. We want to sensitive species authorization helps us prioritize funding, especially through the ESMF funds. Helps us to engage partners, federal land managers, and nonprofits on species we want to focus on. And these also might be species that we want to develop more formal agreements for. And again, we're focusing on these voluntary conservation actions. So what is sensitive species authorization? It's not regulatory in the same way that you think about with the Endangered Species Act. Sensitive species designation does not shut down projects. It just helps to have the conversations to help conserve species. And importantly, sensitive species designations may not be used by governmental entities as a basis to involuntarily restrict private property rights. I've gotten a lot of calls over the years. My neighbor has a burrowing owl on their property, and now they want to build a house or a barn. They can't do that, right? No, that's not how it works. It's just helping us to look where we can proactively work towards conservation. So which species do we include? According to rule, they're native wildlife species or subspecies that have undergone substantial declines in population size or distribution, or without conservation actions, we'd expect them to undergo those declines. And for those species, cooperative management intervention or mitigation of threats is needed. So I mentioned that we wanted to look at the full suite of species in Utah, and we wanted to, look across the board and across different taxon and make sure that we're treating different species in the same way. So we decided to look at conservation status assessments to help us guide what species we wanted to include. These are a widely accepted methodology that's designed to assess extinction risk. Since in an ESA listing, they're looking at the threat of extinction, this seemed really appropriate. It's rigorous, consistent, and transparent methodology. You put values in spreadsheets and it helps come up with the same answer, with the same data, no matter who's doing it. It incorporates rarity, that's both distribution and number within the distribution, threats to the species, and the trends in the population over the short term and the long term. And these are conducted at global or the range of the species, national, and state scales. So for every species, it gets a score from X, which is a species that's presumed to be extinct, or up to a 5, which is a species that we consider secure, a robin, or something like that. So we went looking at all those scores. We decided that a species that had a national rank of 1, 2, or 3, so critically imperiled, or vulnerable, would be something we'd consider for sensitive species designation. Secondarily, a species that nationally looked apparently secure, but as a state, it was ranked imperiled through vulnerable. We wanted to take a second look at that as well. If a state rank has declined, if last time we looked at the species it was secure and now we feel it's vulnerable or imperiled, there's probably something going on, and we wanted to consider that for designation as well. So then once we had that list, we'd sort of looked at, well, what was missing and why might that be? So any species that there was a strong emerging threat that maybe hadn't been captured, we included those species as well. And there were some that we looked at and the designation just wasn't merited on a scientific basis. Perhaps the national rank was old and hadn't been updated. So looking at those things, that's how we came to our list of species. And just for an example, you know, a species we all know well, the sage grouse, it's ranked vulnerable on its global and national scale. And the state of Utah also has it ranked as vulnerable, as you see in that orange color. And that sort of gives you an idea of how it's ranked in surrounding states and provinces. So its rarity, it's not that rare. It's widely distributed and a relatively common species. But when we look at trend, the range has contracted and the abundance has declined. And it has threats of lots of different sorts, anything that results in the loss, fragmentation, and degradation of sagebrush. So taken all together, that was something we'd include in the sensitive species list. Contrast that to something like the Bryan head mountain snail. It receives a G1. It's an endemic species to Utah, incredibly rare. It's only been found over 27 acres in the Bryan head area. I think only 2 or 3 of those acres are considered to be occupied. But the trend is thought to be stable. We found it in the past, we found it again. And there's no one really strong threat, but the fact that it's a single localized population makes it susceptible to catastrophic events. So this is also a species we want to include. Likely it's not going to impact too terribly much, but if the 1 acre that it's occupied, we could shift a project off of it, it could have a big impact to the species. So once we have that species list, we developed species accounts for all those species, and those were the 119 records that you had access to. And the accounts cover the distribution of the species, the abundance and trends, habitat needs and threats. And for threats, we tried to use these standard definitions so that we're calling the same threats the same things. For example, somebody might call a threat a well, and others might call it groundwater pumping. Well, just making sure that we're all calling that groundwater pumping allows us to roll it up and look at how that threat impacts the whole suite of species. And the threat rankings are also based on the scope, how much of a species range does a threat impact, and the severity is, you know, within that scope, could it cause the extinction, or are we just talking about 1 or 2 individuals? We also include the rationale for designation and briefly touch on what we think the economic impacts would be in a species listing. What are the various sectors that could be vulnerable there? So I'm sort of finishing up here. Why do we do this? And why do we continue to do this? And we've had a really strong track record of success over the last 20 years in listing prevention. Many species that are on the sensitive species list have been petitioned. I think it's around 20 or so. And in the vast majority of those cases, because we've engaged in proactive conservation and gathering information on the species, we've been able to get not warranted findings. And only 3 listings during that time as well. And even though those were 3 bird species, and even though they were listed, the information that we've gained over the time they were sensitive species really helped us to impact those listings as well. For example, Gunnison sage grouse was found to be threatened instead of endangered based on the conservation actions that were being taken. And the information that we had gathered on yellow-billed cuckoo really helped to refine some of the critical habitat designations for the species. And finally, you know, we've also made quite a bit of progress on delisting. You know, for quite a while, it was just, you know, the bald eagle and peregrine falcon recovering from historical GDT use. But, you know, in the recent history, we've got quite a few species that are proposed to be downlisted or delisted. These are species that the Fish and Wildlife Service has published a proposed rule, and we're just awaiting the final rule. So delisting includes Kanab amber snail, the wolf, and the humpback chub, and downlisting of the June sucker. The Fish and Wildlife Service has also announced its intent to develop delisting rules for the razorback sucker and Canada lynx. And although it's not necessarily the goal to remove some species from the sensitive species list, in this review, 27 species have come off. So although we've had great success over the last 20 years or so, we really need continued vigilance and need to keep up with this work. The Fish and Wildlife Service has a 5-year work plan and lists out the species that they intend to deal with over that time. And currently there are 8 species that are scheduled on that list. And we also know that a delisting, a not warranted finding, isn't necessarily the finish line. Take, for example, this critter here, the white-tailed prairie dog. It was first petitioned for listing in 2002. And in 2004, it had a negative 90-day finding. And 2000, and then there was a lawsuit, of course. And in 2000, they went back, and in 2010, it was found not warranted for listing. And so, you know, sort of breathed a sigh of relief, but kept up our monitoring efforts for this species and our management efforts nonetheless. And then in 2014, the court case was remanded because it hadn't taken, the judge felt that they hadn't adequately taken into account the effect of oil and gas development on this species. And luckily, you know, we had continued to gather data on the species and worked with our neighboring states to collect data. And we had strong supporting information to show that oil and gas development was not negatively affecting the species. And so then again in 2017, it was found not warranted, and hopefully it will stand up this time. But it just shows, you know, 15 years from the initial petition to our most recent not warranted finding. So it's a marathon, not a sprint. And of course, there's always emerging threats that we need to be prepared to deal with. And we really hope that, you know, rather than meeting at once every 15 years to bring new species to you or taking species off, that we'll be doing this more regularly to update the list as needed. So with that, I'll take any questions that people might have on the process. After this, I'll present the list of species and the coordinators who propose them can deal with any questions. But if people have any questions on the sort of the process here, I'm happy to take those.
I had a quick question. You talked about one of the things that's important is to mitigate the threats for these species. Do you have a standard protocol for what the mitigation measures would be? And I say this because through the years, I've seen lots of different interpretations of what the crucial threats need to be, anywhere from, oh, this 1 month is critical, to 8 months out of the year of this life history for this animal is critical. So just to avoid, I don't know, confusion and just to have some standard protocols in place, has that been considered?
I don't believe it's something we have developed at this time, but I think that would certainly be a good idea. And of course, as you said, it's going to greatly vary depending on the species and its life history characteristics.
I guess I'll just follow up and say, I think it needs to not just be a good idea for this to move forward and for, I think, people to feel comfortable with adding so many species. We need to know that it's not going to, like you say, be used in a way that, I don't know. I just think we need to know that people have given it some thought, and the area that you really need to watch out for because it's critical for that species is this. Otherwise, we will, and we do see quite a bit up at Plipco. Everybody asks for everything. And so what is critical when 8, 9, 10 months out of the year is critical for that life history? So.
And I think, we're working on some species distribution models, especially focusing in on some of these higher priority species of concern to start with, to better define, where are those areas and inform it better than, the more historical sort of big shaded range maps and dots on a map approach.
It's my understanding that we did not have any additional a request for the public provide any presentation or to provide any comments on this proposal. Is that correct?
That is my understanding.
Okay. Further questions from the committee? Seeing none, do we have someone willing to make a recommendation?
And I'll go ahead and, present these species list and,
Okay.
Here's the list of birds. Russ Norvell, our avian coordinator, is here if there's any, specific questions or concerns on any of these species.
So Kim, the ones that are in dark color, those were already on the list, and the ones that are kind of orangish, those are new ones to the list. Is that correct?
Yes, sorry, thank you.
Jim, what are the threats to the pinyon jay? This is Braden, sorry.
Russ, could you?
Sure. Can you hear me okay? Hi, Braden. Threats to pinyon jay include potential management actions, but also most likely we're looking at climate change as a major threat, especially prolonged drought appears to be affecting some of the base. It's a species we like to keep an eye on at this point, given its potential for conflict, and it's then the long-term population declines that have been observed through the breeding bird survey. It's a species we're putting quite a bit of attention into right now. And we'd like to give it head things off before they become more interesting.
Yeah, and just to chime in, this is a species you've had quite a bit of success over the last couple of years in survey efforts too. So although there's been more and more sort of outside concern about the species, we're really collecting good information to show that a pretty widespread and abundant distribution.
That's correct, yeah.
And Russ, this is Jimmy. Please correct me if I'm wrong. I seem to recall it's not such a matter of we know precisely what the threats are. I mean, this has historically been sort of akin to a robin. Like, yeah, there's zillions of them. They're all over the place. Nobody's worried about it. But it's more like, you know what? We've actually noticed a long-term decline. It's not like a death spiral, but it's a long-term, real significant decline. And so we're really at the point of like, oh my gosh, what is causing this? Not like at the point of like definitively, these are the threats that need to be abated. This is where we need to do that. Yada yada yada. So
correct.
Yeah,
we have that does. Thanks, Jimmy. I should mention many birds we don't have really smoking guns for what are the primary threats. We have a lot of data gaps, and we do have good information on long-term declines. So that's probably the driver for many of these species showing up on this list. is because we have evidence of a long-term decline, although we are still as yet looking for maybe the real causes or places where we can intervene most effectively. I can also mention that birds are a little different. To pick one methodology for all of these species, we have no endemic bird species for Utah. So all of these species represent collaborative partnership opportunities for conservation, since you can't do it by yourself. And we did add a few, I think there's 8 new species. We removed 6 and 15 are continuing.
Okay, any other questions here? All right, with that, I will move on to the fish. And we have Sarah Siegert and Paul Badame here if people have any questions.
So it looks like no new fish species because just about all of them are on the list. Is that what I'm seeing?
That's correct.
Yep.
And we did remove 2. One of them was the Lahontan cutthroat trout that is not actually native to Utah, though we do have some populations in Utah. And it had been on the list because of that requirement that any ESA listed species is designated as sensitive species. And the other one was Bonneville cutthroat trout because of the progress we've made on conservation for that species.
Okay, unless I hear anybody speak up, I will move on to the next slide. Reptiles and amphibians. And quite a few species were removed here based on having a lot more data and information.
And I can't really remember, but isn't the relic leopard frog, it is not currently in Utah right now?
That's correct. It's native and extirpated. There's a conservation agreement that we're signatory to, and a listing petition was successfully beat down recently. So the conservation is ongoing and going well.
Thanks, Jimmy.
All right, moving on to the invertebrates, and Kate Holcomb is here, who can answer any questions on those. And we also have a second page of these. Again, a lot of these are those narrowly endemic species.
But a lot came off.
And here's the second page of those. And again, you've got all these species accounts if there's anything you want to take a closer look at later. And finally, here are the mammal species. And just to point out, we have added quite a few bat species, and this is primarily due to the threat of white nose syndrome that has spread across the country and has led to the listing of one eastern species, and two are currently under review for the one, which is found here, the little brown bat. So any species that has been found to have mortality due to white nose syndrome, we have added to our list at this point.
Are the bats here in Utah susceptible to that white nose syndrome, or is that related to areas with more humidity?
Nope, unfortunately, they are susceptible to it. All the species that have been added, little brown bat, long-eared bat, long-legged bat, and Yuma bat, those have all been found to have mortality due to white nose syndrome. We don't know at this time if the population level effects will be the same that they've had in eastern species, but we certainly know that they can have mortality.
So I didn't notice that bighorn sheep and American bison were added to the list. I missed that earlier. With what we've been seeing with bighorn sheep being used as a sensitive species in the Forest Service to edge out grazers and other activities, have you thought about that and how a hunted species might be co-opted? Or maybe it's already being used like that, so I don't know. I just had to make a comment.
Yeah, I would certainly say that it's already being used that way. And, management would follow the management plan. Sensitive species designation doesn't have any impact on that plan that's been developed, and all the thought and effort that's gone into that to address some of those issues that you've brought up.
And Carmen, this is Jimmy. I don't want to speak for Justin, so I won't say much, but we ran the entire inventory of jurisdictional wildlife through the process, and these are the results. This is just like a professional biological staff draft designation list, and really the point of this committee now is to bring in some of those other kind of thoughts like you invoke. So with that, I guess I'd give it to Justin.
I don't have anything to add. I think they fit the criteria.
All right, any other thoughts or concerns there? All right. With that, thank you for your time and for listening, and I will stop sharing here.
Thank you, Kim. Does the committee have any further questions for Kim?
I guess it's been a while since this committee has met. Is there a plan for revisiting where we're at with a body of knowledge for each of these species moving forward? Like every 5 years, we regroup and see if things need to be added and taken off the list?
I think that could be a recommendation from this committee for it to convene periodically, and if it's on a 5-year basis, then or more frequently. I think that probably any of the members on this committee can call this committee together at any time or for review if you would like, within reason.
Carmen, this is Jimmy again. So among division staff, we have sort of acknowledged the utility from several different ways, the utility of sort of constantly assessing the pile and not coming rarely with a giant pile to make a decision about, but on a kind of rotational basis, revisiting our threat assessments. And that's a process that we already undergo in the Wildlife Action Plan. And so, and also just the results of survey and inventory work, the results of active conservation, the results of efforts to diminish data gaps. We totally foresee the need to come together regularly and take stuff off the list or the designations, remove the designations, maybe occasionally add a designated, critter. But most of the division's business is conducted on an annual basis. I mean, we meet every year to revise, harvest objectives or whatever it is, how many, tags we're gonna allocate. Just all kinds of stuff is just a regular routine. This is how we do business. So moving this process into the normal division, activities seems good to us. And also that helps us not forget how to do it or forget to do it. Just like, this group hasn't met for decades, right? So nobody knows what they're doing. Let's try something else.
Any further discussion or comments? I'm open to a motion from one of the committee members to adopt the sensitive species list.
I would like to make a motion to adopt this sensitive species list, but I have two recommendations that I would like to pass along with it. One is that this committee should meet at least 5 years, because I think a decade is too long. I think it's been at least that long. And the other recommendation I would have is that there is an effort to standardize your mitigation measures to mitigate the threats for these species.
Okay, we have a motion. Do we have a second?
Rory, who's on the committee? Just to help me out, okay?
PLIPCO, DWR, Division of Oil, Gas, and Mining, Water Resources.
So just us four.
That's correct.
Okay.
I'd like to ask a question of Carmen on the second part of your motion on the recommendation to standardize mitigation measures. I guess I don't really understand that. Can you explain that a little better?
Yeah, and I'll give you a not so random example that we got in the last several months. Depending on which biologist you talk to, they might say, oh, bighorn sheep might be skittish around certain aerial ziplining, people recreating high up in the Red Rock. So please, it's not just please avoid any of these activities during, and I know I hesitate here because I'm going to use the wrong terms. Is it calving? I know I'm going to get this wrong. Somebody will correct me.
Lambing.
I knew it, lambing. But then they go on to say, and also all these other life stages. So it's not just this critical month and a half. Sometimes they say this is critical along with, see, this is where I'm going to use the wrong terms again. Anyway, several different life history moments. So it ends up, they're asking for basically avoid this area for 8 to 9 months out of the year. And that's not really critical. That's like avoiding the whole area. So I guess my request is that you really think about what is the critical moment that you want activities to be, to not happen in this area. Same thing goes for crucial winter habitat for mule deer. It's a known time, but sometimes new biologists not knowing will also say, oh, but you also need to avoid this time and that time. And again, it ends up being like a 7, 8, 9 month period out of the year. And that's not crucial. That's a lot. So that's what I mean by we need to have some standard lingo and understanding what is, if you're going to avoid an area, if you're going to reduce impacts, or maybe you just are going to mitigate and it's a 4-to-1, there's a direct impact to this habitat. So we want mitigation in a 4-to-1 ratio. Anyway, the habitat section does this all the time. Does that kind of help?
If I understood Kim's presentation, though, the sensitive species list does not have a regulatory impact. So I can understand mitigation and the things you might do to manage the species, but for an agency like oil, gas, and mining, do those mitigation measures have an impact on how we do business?
You may not see the comments, but they are provided to PLIPCO, and that's always my follow-up question. So if the whole idea of putting this down for these species so you could mitigate threats, what does that mean to mitigate threats? Is that just habitat restoration? Or, I mean, a threat to me is a possible development. So we need to think this through so when it does come around, people aren't surprised that we allowed this list to go out and now we can't do a bunch of stuff on private property.
This is Paul Badami. I have kind of a follow-up to clarification of this because I think this is an important point to get through. Are you thinking of standardizing mitigation for every individual threat called out in the Wildlife Action Plan, or for each individual species, or for the combination of each species and their individual threats? So do you want it called out in a specific management or conservation plan, or would that be something added to our Wildlife Action Plan?
Let me put it to you this way. There's a ski resort that's going to be built on private property. And they often go to DWR and say, well, we don't want to hurt wildlife. What do you want us to do? It should stand within reason that you don't ask for, well, you can't put the ski, you can't use the ski resort in a certain way. You should have some standards for what you ask for that really does mitigate the threats for that species.
Okay, let me bring us back to where we've got a motion. We do not have a second. We could have a substitute motion that would come in and let's adopt, that would focus on adopting the sensitive species list. Then we can have a follow-up motion or with recommendations to develop some type of standardized mitigation procedures. So Carmen, would you be willing to amend your motion to that effect?
Yes.
Okay. So do we have a second on the motion to adopt the sensitive species list?
Rory, I'll second that. This is Mike.
Okay, we have a second from John Baza and from Mike Falk. So either one, that's good. So any further discussion on the sensitive species list? All in favor? Say aye.
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 So it's unanimous. So the sensitive species list passed. If one of the committee members would like to make a further motion with a recommendation concerning mitigation measures, now would be the time to do that.
Rory, this is Mike. I'll make a motion that we convene this committee, that it will be our standard to convene this committee every 5 years.
Okay. Do we have a second to that motion?
I'll second that as well.
I'll second it.
We have a second. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Unanimous, it passes. Any further motions from this committee?
I tried.
You can make a motion to adjourn. Okay.
Carmen, Rory, I'd like to ask Carmen. I think I totally understand where you're coming from, Carmen, and in a way this reprises many conversations on this topic that you and I have had. It seems to be a much larger issue than merely sensitive species, though, because I mean, the division in many cases is used, you know, a lot of our partners and stakeholders' resources to develop and protect important fish and wildlife resources. And I mean, they can even be like, you know, sterile hybrid non-game sport fish, you know, like, but our biologists are still going to go to the mat for, you know, protecting our investments in, you know, some, I don't know, a tiger trout in some reservoir, you know. Your desire for some standardized response system, does it extend to the whole enterprise?
Okay, based on the recommendations from this committee, the decision from the executive director's office is to adopt the sensitive species list as presented by the Division of Wildlife Resources and to meet on a 5-year basis at a minimum. So with that recommendation, that will be going to the Wildlife Board at the next Wildlife Board meeting. Okay. If there's no further questions.
Rory, I want to jump in. I want to thank my staff for the hard work and the diligence they put in to coming up with this list. It's sound, it's reasoned. The approach was methodical and well done. And I truly appreciate what they've done to put this list together. And I think we need to move forward with this, and we'll continue to do the best job we can to mitigate what's on this list and how we deal with those approaches. So with that, I'd make a motion to adjourn.
Okay. Second.
Second.
This meeting's adjourned. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you all.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.